The Secret Language, Chapter 12, The Hut. In April, Martha and Victoria began to wake up early every morning. They wanted to get up at 5:30 and go outdoors, but no one was allowed to get out of bed before 6:30, and since the disastrous midnight feast, Martha and Victoria were making a real effort not to break any rules. One morning, when they were whispering to each other at 5:30, Martha said, "We could at least get dressed now and be all ready to go outdoors when it's 6:30. We could get dressed in bed." "But how can we get our clothes out without getting out of bed?" "I can reach my underwear drawer from here. I can't reach yours, but you can wear some of mine." Martha leaned out of bed, pulled open one of her bureau drawers, threw underwear and socks up to Victoria, and took out some for herself. Both girls dressed silently. "Finished?" Martha whispered. "Yes, but how can we get our outside things?" Martha looked at the clothes they had put on their chairs the night before. They were supposed to hang them in the closet, but if they put them neatly folded on the backs of their chairs, the house mother didn't object. "Hey, look," Martha whispered suddenly. She reached under her bed and pulled out a long, thin stick of wood. She had been saving it for weeks. She had known it would come in handy sometime. After a few unsuccessful attempts, she hooked it under Victoria's skirt and tossed the skirt up to Victoria. Next, she fished for and caught Victoria's blouse. Then she slowly lifted her own skirt and blouse from her chair and pulled them onto her bed. At 6:30, both girls jumped out of bed, fully dressed except for their shoes. They ran to the bathroom to wash, dashed back to their room and combed their hair, and hurried downstairs. They were outdoors at 20 minutes to 7. They started to walk toward a little wood in the back of Shippen Hall. "We can look for violets," Victoria suggested. "No violets yet," Martha said, "but we can look, of course. You know what, Vicky?" she said thoughtfully, as they walked into the wood. "We could ask permission to get up early every morning for a while, and we could come out here before breakfast every morning, if she'll let us. And," here Martha spoke very slowly, "we could build a hut." "Build a hut?" Victoria repeated huskily. "Martha, do you think she'd let us?" "We'll ask her tonight after lights out," Martha said. "Let's look around for a good place to build it." Sunlight fell on them through the pale green leaves of maple and birch as they wandered through the little wood. "How about here?" Martha pointed to a small open space among the trees. "We could use that tree stump as a table, and that fallen-over tree as part of the back wall." Victoria, standing in the early morning sunshine in the little clearing, was silent and happy. She had never helped to build a hut before, but she couldn't wait to begin. When it was time for breakfast, they left the wood and walked to the dining room. They didn't talk about the hut, but off and on all during that sunny spring day, they thought about the hut they were going to build, and they made their plans. When Miss Denton came to their room to say good night, Martha told her that they'd dressed in bed that morning so they could go outside as early as possible. "May we please have permission to get up early and go out in the mornings?" Martha asked. The house mother thought it over. "It is beautiful early in the morning now," she said at last. "You girls need your rest, but if you wake up early anyway—" Martha took a deep breath. "We want to build a hut," she explained. "Don't tell anyone, but that's what we want to do. Please let us." "Build a hut? Where?" "In the woods in back of here. Please let us. Please say yes." The house mother looked at them and then out the window. Finally she said, "Well, all right. If you are both so quiet you won't wake anyone, you may dress early and go out at 6 o'clock, but not 1 minute earlier. And you must absolutely tiptoe down the stairs and open and close the front door quietly. Will you promise?" "We promise. Thank you very much." "Good night, girls." "Good night." Martha began to whisper first. "Hey, Vic, maybe we can finish the hut before spring vacation." 17 days. "We can finish it long before. Then I can tell Richie about it." "This time tomorrow it will only be 16 days, Victoria said. She was longing for it to be time to go home to see her mother. "That's plenty of time. I can't wait to tell Richie. You know what, Vicky?" "No, what?" "Ricky had that secret language first. He made up Ikenspick and Libasa." "He did?" Victoria was amazed. "Yes, he did. I just made up Ankendosh." Victoria leaned over the edge of her bed and tried to look at Martha in the dark. "But I thought you despised to copy anybody." "Well, I do. But Richie's different." "Oh." Victoria pulled herself back into her bed. Anyhow, Enkendosh is good too, she said. I wish I could make up a word sometime. Maybe you can. Anyhow, tomorrow we'll start our hut. The next morning at 6 o'clock they tiptoed down the stairs and walked quietly down the graveled path to the woods. What'll we do first? Martha said. She studied the place they had selected. We'll have to figure out what to use for walls. She looked at the fallen tree. It still had a few branches on it. Let's look around for some old boards, Vicky. We can nail them onto those branches. I don't think Mother Carey will let us do much nailing, Victoria said. Probably not, Martha agreed. But we can lean some flat boards against those branches somehow and maybe tie them. We don't care if the rain comes in. When we get some walls, maybe we could use my old raincoat for the roof, Victoria suggested. Lee Bassa, said Martha. 5 days later they had done quite a lot on the hut. The branches of the fallen tree served as sturdy props to hold the flat boards. Mr. Hardy had let them have 2 large, thin, wooden bicycle crates, and those made excellent sidewalls. They brought out Victoria's old raincoat, and Martha climbed up onto the tree stump table, which was now in the middle of the hut, and draped the raincoat over the tops of the 3 walls. Then she and Victoria stood in front of the hut and looked it over. Now we just need a front wall and some sort of door, Martha said. For several days, work on the hut was at a standstill. They couldn't think of what to use for a front wall and a door. Finally, Victoria suggested that they ask for permission to walk down the road to the old Perry place. No one had lived there for years, and though the students at Coburn School were not permitted to go into the house, or even up to the sagging porch, they were sometimes allowed to wander around the fields beside the Perry house. Maybe we'll get an idea there anyhow, Victoria said hopefully. They received permission for their walk, and after classes they scurried away. At least Victoria hurried, and tried to urge Martha to walk faster too. But Martha was in an unusually silent, listless mood. She didn't want to admit it, but she was discouraged. At the Perry place she became gloomier. Look at that old haunted house, she said. Oh, do you think it's haunted? Victoria asked. Of course not, but it looks awful, doesn't it? They stared up at the house, at the torn blinds, the broken front steps, the unpainted gray shingles, the crumbling chimney. I haven't had any good ideas yet, Martha said in a hollow voice. Come on. Victoria didn't want to stand there any longer. Come on. Let's go round and back. We'll have a good plan. I almost know it. But Martha continued to stare mournfully at the house. Maybe the Perrys are still living inside there, she said. Maybe they're still inside, and all they have to eat is cold rice pudding, because their chimney is broken, and they can't even have a fire in their dusty old fireplace. She stopped for a moment, lost in thoughts. Their fireplace is full of old cobwebs, she added, warming to her story. It's full of old cobwebs, and the chimney is broken, and they just sit there eating cold old rice pudding, and the floor creaks. Oh, Martha! Victoria couldn't bear to listen any more. Come on, let's look around in the back. They went behind the house and walked along a little path overgrown with weeds. Suddenly Victoria found what she'd wanted them to find, without having known exactly what it would be. It was the old Perry dump heap. Oh, Lee Bassa, Martha muttered as she realized what it was. Oh, Lee Bassa, she chanted softly. They poked at the dump heap and kicked aside some old galoshes and old pieces of wire. They pulled out a torn piece of carpet and tossed aside a dirty Indian blanket. They walked around the dump heap and prodded and pushed. They found old magazines and old shoes and rusted tin cans. And at last they uncovered a weather-beaten door. It had no doorknob, and one of the boards was missing, but it was a door. Victoria took one end, Martha took the other, and they walked around the Perry house and set off down the road back to school. Martha looked back at the Perry house and ducked her head politely. Thank you, she said. Enjoy your cold rice pudding. The next morning everything went more easily. Mr. Hardy offered them a small wooden crate, which was wide enough in front for the front wall when they put the door beside it. Now we need a window, Victoria said, so we can sit in here and read, and so we can look out when we want to. A window was a difficult problem. Several times Mr. Hardy had offered to help them, but Martha thought they should figure out the window themselves. There we go. One morning, she asked Mr. Hardy to lend her his saw, and he refused. He said he'd be glad to lend the saw to her if the school belonged to him. But, he said flatly, he couldn't lend the saw to her in view of the fact that the school did not belong to him. "Why do you want it?" he asked casually. "I just want to make a window," Martha told him. "If you'll just lend me your old saw, I can saw one of the boards in the back wall and make a window space there. Vicky can hold the board so the wall won't come down." "Tell you what," Mr. Hardy said. "You won't let me saw it for you, and I can't let you take my saw and saw it yourself. But I can hold the board for you, and just put my other hand on top of yours while you do the sawing. That way you do the sawing, but I don't let you take my saw. How's that? That a fair proposition?" "I think it's a fair proposition, Mr. Hardy," Victoria said. "Don't you, Martha?" "Oh, all right, it's a fair proposition," Martha agreed. "I'll meet you there with the saw at 3:30, Mr. Hardy promised. After school, they went to the hut. Martha stood on a crate Mr. Hardy had brought, and he held the board she was going to saw. The sawing took a long time, but finally Martha did saw through the board on a slant, and a triangular piece of wood dropped out of the back wall. She handed the saw back to Mr. Hardy and thanked him, then ran around to the front of the hut. She and Victoria went in, pulled the front door shut, and sat down on the ground beside the tree stump table. "Is it light enough?" Mr. Hardy called into them. "It's just lovely," Victoria said, looking around happily. They sat on a carpet of pine needles beside their table, and sunlight came through the three-cornered window and shone on them both. "Take a look, Mr. Hardy," Martha called. "Look at us in our hut." Mr. Hardy's face appeared at the window, and he grinned at them. Then he withdrew his head. "Well, so long," he called. "Goodbye, and thanks a lot, Mr. Hardy," they shouted. "Oh, I wish we could just live here," Martha said, and lay down in the sunlight on the pine needles. "So do I," Vicky said. "Isn't it a beautiful hut, Martha?" Martha looked around. "It is," she agreed. "We have to figure out some furniture now, but anyhow, the hut is finished. And it's beautiful."